The topic of redistricting has come up, and there are other voting rights issues that you might want to discuss. In your opinion, what are the most pressing voting rights and election reforms that are necessary? What particular changes would you propose, and why would they be needed? We have some of the possibilities are impartial, nonpartisan redistricting, easier voter registration, less restrictive absentee voting rules, vote tabulation machine improvements, or public financing of campaigns. Would any of those strike your fancy?
Bruce, you just answered my question. Every single one of those is...
And which one would be most important?
Well, having a nonpartisan redistricting commission is essential. We allow gerrymandering to happen, and it harms the people who live there more than anybody else. Eliminating the voter ID regulations, because the amount of voter fraud that we've seen over the past 2 decades has been de minimis at best, and it's just a complete sham when people say that we've got voter fraud going on. We need to make it easier for people to vote. We need to make it easier for people to vote early. We need to make it easier for our broader populations to be involved in the voting process. To the extent that we can encourage, one of the things that this city did was consolidate elections so that way we're not voting the way Arlington is voting, for example. They've had 3 elections in the past 3 weeks. I think we need to do something a little bit better than that. By consolidating our elections to these single elections, we can ensure that we get more people out.
Mr. Levine?
Wow, okay, nonpartisan, as a voter protection attorney for the Democratic Party of Virginia, these things are very personal to me, and as someone who drafted the brief challenging Bush v. Gore. All right, nonpartisan commission, absolutely, that's the way they do it in Iowa, it's the way they do it in California. We've got to stop gerrymandering. Paper ballots to ensure a fair and non-fraud process. Same-day voter registration. You should be able to go in and vote. They can go, they can take your picture, and if you commit in-person voting fraud, throw the person in jail. It's virtually unheard of. Weekend voting, we have to expand the days you can vote. What, Tuesday, most of us aren't on our farms anymore. Let's have it all the weekend through Tuesday. Let's have no-fault absentee ballots. Let's make sure that everyone who wants to vote, who can't be there, can vote. A lot of states have these things. Oregon's been very successful in it. And one last thing, I'm sorry, Virginia, we don't have to vote every year. Let's move it, in my long-term wildest dreams, let's move back to the even years so we can vote like the rest of the nation except New Jersey votes. That's my wildest dream, but it might take some time.
I think there's 2 major issues. One is voter rights and the opportunity to vote, and there are a number of things we can do about that. And second, and I support all of them, would like to talk about them for a second. The other thing I'd like to talk about for a second is the redistricting process. If in fact, I think, I'd be surprised if you don't agree, nonpartisan redistricting is a must. It's actually how we create less dissension and splits and polar discussions on the floor of the House in Richmond and frankly on the floor of the House in Congress. But we also need to talk about access to voting. All of the changes we've seen to make voter ID required, the changes to the absentee balloting process, increase pressure and dissuade folks from voting who we really need to see at the polls. They make it harder for seniors. Has anybody done, if you've done mail-in absentee balloting, it is incredibly complicated, and many of us help our senior parents with such a thing. They would not be able to do it on their own. We don't have fraud in absentee balloting in any measure any more than we do with regular voter fraud. We need to get rid of the ID laws. We also need to regularize how we do voting across the state. In Alexandria, we are privileged to have a lot of opportunities for early voting that not everyone else does. We need to actually create those opportunities that we have here all the way across.
Mr. Tom?
So as the chair of the Alexandria Democrats, I was a big proponent of voter expansion, and I'm actually a participant in Dr. Ferguson Reed's 90 for 90 project. His effort to try to register more voters across the country, because if people can't participate in voting for their representatives, they don't have a voice. I would be a strong proponent of repealing the voter ID law that was put into effect last year, and also support efforts to increase the amount of opportunities for early voting and in-person absentee voting. You had mentioned redistricting. I'm going to speak to that very briefly. Back in 2005, there were 45 Democratic seats in the House of Delegates, and now there are 32. And part of that was losing elections at the wrong time, but also a lot of that had to do with gerrymandering. And I would definitely support efforts to make sure we have redistricting that is more fair. And finally, with the last few seconds, I am a strong proponent of campaign finance reform. I think that's the only way that we can definitely serve the public interest.
Mr. Fire.
Well, as I said, I strongly support redistricting reform. I'm a member of One Virginia 2021, which is a non-profit, nonpartisan organization promoting redistricting reform. So that I won't repeat what we all seem to agree on, let me touch on a few other areas. I think restoration of voting rights is a critical part of keeping all of our potential voters engaged in the democracy in which they live. We also need to reform sentencing to keep so many people from winding up with felony convictions in the first place for crimes that don't warrant it, or if they do warrant a felony conviction, be able to have their rights restored once they've paid their debt to society. I've worked for many, many years on voting rights. In particular, I drafted a bill that required the State Board of Elections to create uniform requirements for how registrars judge people's residency. Then I served as the only representative of the Democratic Party of Virginia on the state task force that wrote those regulations to make sure college students could vote, people who are homeless could vote, our military service members could vote, etc.
Mr. Olson? Or you start this one.
Let's start.
Mr. Levine.